Golly. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I'd like to thank Tricia Craig of the Center for and the Center for European Studies. I'd like to thank Harvey Mansfield and the Program on Constitutional Government, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming. I imagine, Harvey was sort of snickering at the title that was given to my lecture. I don't seem to recall that I gave it to it, but anyway, to those of you who are wondering what I mean by doomed, or at least by allowing the word doom to appear in the title, I don't mean to imply that Europe is going to cease to exist anytime soon. I'm 100% certain that Europe will still exist as a geographic entity months and years from now. I'm slightly less certain that it will still exist as a cultural entity. Nonetheless, I think it highly probable. Now, I hope that little crossed E symbol makes clear, it's not Europe the place or the worldview that we're going to talk about here, but Europe the experiment in nation building, that is the European Union. I don't yet have an opinion on the new Greek rescue plan that has just been voted by European leaders, but I hope that we can talk about the broad consequences of Europe's experiment in multinational government and monetary union. At the moment, as various countries in the Eurozone struggle against bankruptcy, those consequences look a bit dire. Now, doom might not be exactly the mot juste for that, but this crisis is going to cost Europeans certain things that they consider essential to Europe. And I would say that the first thing to go, in fact, it is partially already gone, is democracy. The Euro crisis is causing the world of politics and the world of economics to collide. They're perhaps more intertangled in Europe than they are here, but the basic problem that we've had over the last several years is that the new currency tethered dynamic and non-credit-worthy economies like Ireland and Spain, together with one especially sluggish, predictable and reliable one, which is Germany, which was also at a time when Germany was struggling for oxygen under the weight of reunification. And what that wound up meaning, to make a long story short, is that the interest rates on these southern European countries with a lot of growth potential were too low. This is basically, the European Union basically took a set of rules that were appropriate to an order of mendicant nuns and applied them to a bunch of randy teenagers. It was that sort of thing. So the result, in the best of cases, was a housing boom, say in Ireland and Spain, even a housing boom even more excessive than we had in the United States, but minus the reserve currency that's allowed us to temper the blow. In the worst of cases, where actual serious political corruption was added into the bargain, as in Greece, the money didn't even go into anything so real as real estate, and the result, according to a lot of Greek economists, was simply the building down of the country's non-import sector. So, but in both cases, whether the Irish case or the Greek case, you get countries deprived of the main instrument that countries have generally used to export their way out of messes like this one. The economists who said that you can't unite countries in a single currency unless you unite them under a single central government would appear to have been proved right. And this has implications for the entire project of building the European Union. The European Union was sold to a lot of its citizens in two ways. First, it would be a freedom-enhancing sphere of shared prosperity and of a consumerist kind. Second, it would constrain German political ambitions, which are attached to Germany's always dynamic economy and society, so that Germany did not disrupt the European equilibrium by proving too big for Europe, as it has so many times in the past. I would say that the EU has failed on both those counts. expanding freedom and constraining Germany. And I would say that on the one hand, this was neither Germany's plan nor its wish, but on the other hand, not everyone in Europe seems to realize that. So as we look at the storm, the macroeconomic storm, we can say, that is now passing through Europe, we should bear in mind that it's a storm that the EU's promoters knew would come. The designers of the euro, they understood this Rahm Emanuel philosophy about never letting a crisis go to waste. There's a famous quotation by one of the European community's founding fathers, Jean Monnet, who said, "Europe will be forged in crises, and it will be the sum of the solutions brought on by these crises." Now, when this French statesman Jacques Delors laid out his plan for the euro in the late 1990s, he drew a clear trajectory of what was going to happen. A common market had made possible a common currency. A common currency would make possible a common government. But how would that happen, and why? Because if, contrary to what history has taught, it proved possible to have a currency that was not under the control of any one state, then in fact there would be no reason to change the existing governing arrangements that Europe had. The only way that you would get institutional change in Europe, as far as I can see, and I'm willing to be corrected on this if I'm wrong, would be if the currency blew up. Economic crisis, and hopefully not too severe, would be the kind of accidentally on purpose pretext for a consolidation of power in Brussels. So the present group of Europe's national leaders, in the midst of crisis, have been brought to a difficult choice. Either of they're being told that the most likely solution to their problem is fiscal union, and that means, that's another way of saying that their choice is between giving up their 10-year-old money or their ancient sovereignties. And right now, it would be a mistake to bet against the 10-year-old money. So I'd like to talk about, I mentioned a threat to democracy, or an exit from democracy, and I'd like to talk about this. There are different ways to measure this, and I'd like to look at this issue under three different aspects. First is the increasing prominence of so-called fiscal union in the list of solutions to the crisis. Fiscal union sounds good. It sounds like international cooperation. What it basically means is having prudent countries cover the debts of profligate ones. But there's little agreement really on how this is going to happen. I mean, last fall I spoke to a Deutsche Bank economist who told me in Germany, fiscal union basically means you send fiscal policemen into southern European countries to force them to have austerity budgets. When the Southerners talk about fiscal union, they expect large-scale transfers from north to south. So in other words, northern countries want another level of European government. Southern countries want something like what we would call a euro bond, a common borrowing instrument. And effectively, this is the crucial step in building the EU. It is, in a way, it is the moment Jacques Delors was waiting for, because it means removing budgetary authority from parliaments, not just in crisis times, but in ordinary times. And that is why this is so pivotal, this moment, because an entity without control of a budget is not a state. It can be an interesting entity, but it's not a state. And this is what we are talking about when we talk about fiscal union, is at a very fundamental level disbanding the countries of Europe as they now stand. And I have a very hard time believing that the peoples of Europe will vote for that democratically when the issue is framed to them that way, as I think it inevitably will be. Now, a second way to measure this exit from democracy is through the tendency, which has been more evident in recent months, over the past winter, to replace elected leaders with unelected ones. In early November, in the week after the G20 summit, European leaders presented Greek President Papandreou with a plan to stop the country's spiraling finance crisis. And even with a partial write-off on its debt, as I think you all know, Greece owes more money than it can reasonably expect to pay back. Many economists, especially on the left, believe that imposing austerity is really, at this point for Greece, only a matter of pain for pain's sake, as one banker told Britain's Guardian newspaper. Whether you agree with those economists or not, and I must say I tend to agree with them, there was nothing ignoble about Papandreou's proposal to ask his countrymen's permission on a decision that will bind them not just for the next few years, but for at least the next generation. The European Union's leaders, however, and not any duly constituted body of them, by the way, but I mean Nicolas Sarkozy and Angela Merkel, speaking as the leaders of individual states, they offered Greece the choice between remaining in the Eurozone and replacing Papandreou with a technocrat. Now, well, here you can say, all right, it looks undemocratic, but really that's just a constraint on Greece's democracy that's being imposed, suggested from outside, but imposed from within. I can see the point to that. But I think more serious is probably the way that Silvio Berlusconi was replaced as Prime Minister of Italy at about the same time last fall. Like him or not, admire his style with women or not, this was the elected Prime Minister of his country. He enjoyed full constitutional legitimacy. What's more, over the long term, although he didn't do much right in terms of fiscal policy, he didn't do that much wrong either. Italy has very low deficits, and its debt is roughly where it was when, as a percentage of GDP, when Berlusconi came to power in 1994. Not many European countries can say that. What Berlusconi did wrong is he confounded the EU's attempt to use the European Central Bank to resolve Italy's debt crisis. Basically, when the EU bought Italian state debt in order to drive Italy's interest rates down to sustainable levels, no sooner had they bought the debt than Berlusconi reneged on the promises of austerity that he'd made and cut a deal with Italian labor unions who had been arguing for more money. This was pretty devious, even by the political standards of Silvio Berlusconi. And it was as such, it was unsatisfactory to banks and to the EU functionaries who sought a replacement of him. And they got a replacement, and that is the economist Mario Monti, who's not only a man suitable to bankers and EU functionaries, but who is a banker and former EU functionary himself. The Italian President Giorgio Napolitano named Monti a senator for life, and he was confirmed in the legislature. Now, Monti, as it happens, is an excellent economist and a genuinely gifted politician of a bureaucratic sort. I mean, without going into detail, he did a very good job of managing the antitrust issues around Microsoft when he was the EU's competitiveness commissioner. But I think we have a tendency to get distracted from the central, primary, pivotal question of constitutionality, of Italian sovereignty, by the peripheral secondary question of whether Monti is a good guy or whether he's a better guy than Silvio Berlusconi. I mean, if that were the standard, I could be Prime Minister of Italy. Now, here the same skeptic might say, yeah, okay, this is undemocratic or semi-democratic, but what it has to do with is an undemocratic element that's already present in the Italian constitution. It would be kind of like the, let's say, the replacement of the Australian government by the Queen in the mid-1970s. And again, maybe that's true. But I think that a Rubicon in this tendency towards less democratic means of selecting heads of state and heads of government was crossed this week when the German finance minister, Wolfgang Schäuble, suggested on a German radio show that Greece postpone its elections, which are due this spring, in order that the government, the caretaker, technocratic government of Nikos Papadimos have the time to impose the Greek austerity plan. The FT columnist Wolfgang Munschau suggested this week that perhaps what Schäuble was trying to do was to goad Greeks into leaving the Eurozone, and I think he's probably right. But that doesn't lessen the irony. You have no politician in Europe has been more of an evangelist for the European order in the post-war than Wolfgang Schäuble. He's a protege of Helmut Kohl. He's a person who believes from the bottom of its heart that Germany's statesmen need to strive towards a European Germany and not a German Europe, to use Thomas Mann's formulation. So if this European project cannot be carried out by democratic means, then apparently it is not the European project that is going to have to go. Now I'd like to look at a third aspect to this, and it's not a third aspect to this, let's say, this bad season that democracy is going through. And that's not anti-democratic behavior by European leaders, so much as a loss of support for the EU that's making itself felt in European publics. As I said a minute or two ago, there are two ways to look at what a state is. You can look at it as, from a constitutional perspective, you can say a state's a sovereign body that makes decisions and sets priorities through its budget. And if it doesn't have a budget, it's not a state. There's also an anthropological perspective, which is to say that a state is a common association for mutual defense. So with these two measures in mind, budget and defense, I think we can better understand the evolution of this whole project away from democracy. And I would set up a sort of a timeline of the evolution of Europe that I could break into three parts. The first part, I would say, is in the 50s and 60s, when the mythological description of how Europe came together. The people who run Europe today tend to describe it as a coal and steel community that just kept proving its effectiveness in new areas until, almost by accident, it wound up with an ambition to govern. That it sort of sleepwalked into its governing role. I would say, in fact, that the early dreamers of the European Union saw the logic of integration much more clearly than that. It was almost at the same time as the original coal and steel union that the original EU countries banded together and sought to form a European defense community. This was rejected by the French Parliament on the grounds that, while economics was one thing, the core business of states, the defense, was quite another. But I believe the desire to constitute a government was present in the European dream from the very beginning. Now, there's a second period now in this timeline of European history, and that's a period of growing democratic legitimacy for the EU, which ran roughly, say, from Britain's admission through referendum in 1975, through the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, and probably up until the beginning of this century. Generally, Europe held referenda in which the citizens of countries, and in many cases the parliaments of countries, kept surrendering more and more aspects of self-rule to Brussels. There are ways to question this legitimacy. I mean, you can say that the Republic was under the impression that it was voting on economic matters, while the builders of Europe interpret these votes as political mandates. You can also say that the whole process of building Europe, while it was democratic in form, did rest on a trick of consent that was anti-democratic in spirit. And that is, referenda were interpreted differently depending on whether the results favored the desire, whether they got the desired result. So a yes in favor of transferring power to the European Union wasn't a key. It was something that was set in stone forever. While a no, such as the Danish rejection of Maastricht in the beginning, or the Dutch, or the Irish rejection of the Nice Treaty about 10 years later, a no was only an excuse for another vote, and anyone who didn't vote yes on that, only a fascist or a killjoy would want to oppose the European project. Now, I would say that I would say that period of European consolidation ended in 2005, when the EU asked its citizens to approve a transfer of political power explicitly through a constitutional referendum. And the repudiation, I would say, was really decisive. The French rejected this treaty with 55% of the vote after certainly the most intense national political discussion they'd had since 1968 and possibly since the war. The Dutch rejected the treaty by almost 2-1. And at that point, all other referenda were canceled except the one in Luxembourg. So you can say that if you look at the history of the European Union, you have one period of great momentum. You have a high tide of European institution building and growing legitimacy, which is sandwiched by 2 periods of Euroscepticism. But in fact, those periods of Euroscepticism are different, because in the 1950s, when a skeptical public looked at European integration did not proceed. In the new millennium, faced with a skeptical public, the continent's rulers have sought new rules to make what they want anyway palatable. So, after the failure of the constitutional treaty in 2005, many of its main attributes were passed by bilateral treaty. So, it's in this spirit. It's often said that it was a mistake to build for Europeans to build monetary Europe, to build the euro, that is, before they had built a political Europe in the 1990s. But I think it's now clear that the political Europe that people mean by this was never really there to be built. Right now, the Eurozone's leaders look to me as if they are biding their time, hoping that they'll be struck by an inspiration of how to alter the rules of Europe to their liking without the greater public noticing. And why do they believe they can do this? I would say it's because that high tide of European consolidation have left its mark on Europe's leaders, and they've pulled this off many times before. Now, this is a matter of institutions, not sentiments. But I would like to talk about sentiments just a little bit before I close. The European crisis, it strikes me, is a member of a family of crises of democratic capitalism, and it has some. It is not identical to our banking crisis, but it has certain things in common. And I'd like to take this opportunity to mention one of the most extraordinary, in the sense of extraordinarily interesting and intelligent, interpretations of the banking crisis that I've read in the past few years. There's a German sociologist, some of you have maybe heard of, named Wolfgang Streeck. While he's a sociologist, he's also a thinker of great subtlety and complexity. And he laid out his view of what is happening to modern welfare states in an essay in the New Left Review last fall that I thought was just extraordinary. And since I'm not usually someone who finds himself bobbing himself up and his head up and down in agreement with the New Left Review, I thought I would mention this. Strake's thesis is that in a free market democracy, you wind up with a conflict between two ways of allocating goods. You can have market allocation and you can have political allocation, and they clash. Basically, the simplest expression to describe the way they clash is to say that the politicians who get elected are the ones who most credibly offer a free lunch. But one of the things that impressed me about Strake's description of this is that he offers up, even in the pages of the New Left Review, he offers up a sacred cow of the left at the very beginning. He admits that the high wages of the post-war boom, what we would call the happy days and what the French call les trente glorieuses, those high wages were, although he does not use this word, a bubble. As he put it, quote, government's commitment to full employment, together with a growing welfare state, protected unions from potential employment losses caused by wage settlements in excess of productivity growth. Government policy thus leveraged the bargaining power of trade unions beyond what a free labor market would have sustained. That is, he doesn't make the claim that that the role of promoting labor union representation merely rectifies a distortion in the market. Strake describes a world in which no government can long stay in power unless it offers people something more than they would ordinarily get in the normal market allocation of things. After all, that's what the political allocators are there for. So in the 1960s, and the great thing about what he does is he describes a real chain reaction and that carries on in a very interesting way. In the 1960s, when trade unions began to break business, government stepped in to moderate trade union demands by offering various entitlements in exchange. When those entitlements began to burden the state, central banks tried to inflate them away. When that inflation tried to slow down the economy, say in the early 1980s, the government fixed that problem too, but it did so only by running huge deficits. And his way of putting this is to say, as with inflation, public debt made it possible to introduce resources into the distributional conflicts of the time that had not yet in fact been produced, enabling governments to draw on future resources in addition to those already on hand. Now, so when government deficits and debts began to scare markets, governments paid them off. That was what happened in the 1990s. But as they did so, they deregulated the private sector, allowing individual citizens to replace public with private debt. And the final stage of what happens, in Strake's telling, is that democratic states get turned into what he calls, quote, debt-collecting agencies on behalf of a global oligarchy of investors, compared to which C. Wright Mills's power elite appears a shining example of liberal pluralism. He doesn't usually write in that tone, but I was struck by the analysis, and even if you don't agree with it 100%, I urge you to go out and absorb it, because it'll greatly enrich your way of looking at this. Now, in closing, I'd like to say that kind of analysis may perhaps apply better to our welfare state than it does to Europeans' currency crisis. I think it certainly does apply to the predicament the EU finds itself in Greece, where what is happening is that the democracy is demanding more from the economy than the economy, as presently constituted, is able to deliver. And I'd love to have your thoughts on these matters. I offer my own ideas in all modesty, although, as time goes on, I will offer them in an increasingly arrogant and peremptory way, following the example of the EU. So, thank you very much. I don't know if anyone would like to raise any points or ask any questions. I would be delighted. Yes, ma'am.
Perspective on how Germany has handled the euro crisis, in particular bearing in mind the criticisms of Christine Lagarde recently?
I don't know the specific criticisms you mean of that Lagarde made of Germany, but that I believe you mean says Germany has not paid enough attention to internal balances of payments. Is that?
More that she said it's not the right time for austerity, more those kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, this is a debate that's going on in a lot of countries. I suppose Germany would make the argument that that you cannot, at this stage of the crisis, before the Greek and the Italian and the Portuguese houses in order, take the pressure off the debtor countries. At least that is, when I talk to people in Germany, that's what they say. And in fact, they use verbs like partying. If we agree to finance these debts even a little bit, they will start partying again. Now, is this correct? Whether this is correct, I think, is a matter of political ideology. I think if you are if you're a Keynesian, I think the right thing to do is probably to is probably to keep the economy liquid and move this forward until there's a more opportune moment for the Greeks and the others to pay off their debt. If you're not a Keynesian, you probably want to keep the right incentives in place. Is Germany right to take this non-Keynesian view? If I were a German, I would probably take the same. I would probably take the same view they're doing. I would probably be doing what they're doing. But that is as much a matter of personal preference as sort of. I can't offer you an objective answer on that. It's an ideological answer as much as a scientific one. Yes, ma'am.
If I may, I agree with a lot of what you said and irritated by some of it.
God bless you. That's good. That's good. Yeah.
I think that the big issue in most European states today is a capacity for structural reform or not. The idea that Greece can spend its way out of what is a current account deficit and very significant fiscal deficits it can't do it. There will be a fiscal consolidation in Greece. There would be with or without the euro. So and equally for Ireland, Ireland has a fiscal deficit, no longer a current account deficit. So the question is, being a member of both a single currency but also a highly competitive market regime requires a capacity for internal adjustment. And what we have seen over the last 10 years is a strong capacity in some states, Germany being one, and much weaker capacity in others. And I don't think we should reduce it all to the Euro states, because the Nordic states have displayed a very strong capacity for internal adjustment as well. And they have had a very interesting combination of liberalising their labour markets, but a very strong social solidarity underpinning it. So I think there's a lot of variety. But the real problem for many European states is their capacity for for structural adjustment in a highly globalizing world. And that won't go away. So I think that the euro crisis has brought a lot of the tensions to the fore. But there are, one of the great lessons of European integration is that it makes what you do domestically more, not less important.
Yes.
And Greece and Ireland, and I mean, I'm an Irish citizen who has experienced austerity now for 5 years. The idea that Ireland could spend its way out of this crisis is simply not an available option. Mm-hmm. It's not an available option. There has to be a fiscal consolidation, and fiscal consolidations are always painful. I think the other very important thing to remember about Europe at the moment is the intergenerational equity. That people of a particular age, and I'm over 50, so I include myself in that, we have taken too much out. We have endowed ourselves with pensions and whatever. So I think that it's the intergenerational inequities in Europe need to be tackled, and that does mean tackling some of the problems. So I don't think there are easy answers for Europe at the moment, and certainly for many countries in Europe. But I think that because of the nature of the euro crisis, it's too easy to have the sort of morality tale that it's the profligate Greeks versus the stringent Germans or whatever. Some of this, but it's only a very small part of what Europe faces, and it faces a very serious demographic challenge as well.
Yeah, I think that I think you're right. I find that I find that a very convincing account of what's going on. And when we talk about internal adjustments, I mean, there are two things we can be talking about. One is inside of the traditional nation states, right, where you have something resembling what we would call in the United States, if we didn't like it, a race to the bottom. You have a lot of downward pressure on wages. You have a lot of reform pressure on benefits, and the countries that do that most credibly, such as Germany in the Agenda 2010 of 2003 and thereafter, wind up very much better positioned. I mean, no country could really do that now. The question is whether, when we talk about you need internal flexibility. A lot of that internal flexibility, I think, in this country gets handled by transfers and and automatic stabilizers that move money from certain parts of the U.S. to other parts. And here is where we have the democracy economics problem, because Europe, a majority of Europeans have not yet shown themselves willing to accept that kind of state-to-state transfer. So I think you're quite right that that's where we are. Maybe someone would disagree, but Mr. Mistral.
Thank you for your
Yeah.
presentation.
Oh,
I
thank
don't
you.
agree with everything. But,
I'm surprised you agree with anything.
a few things.
Yeah.
I would like to make one comment and raise three questions for the future. The comment is related to your strong opinion that the process is working against democracy. And I contest that because you took the example of the fiscal union as a limit to sovereignty of national governments. It's not the fiscal union which limits the sovereignty of national governments. It's the ability to attract external financing. I just want to remember that the last OECD country to have faced the rule of the IMF within its treasury
Is Britain. Yeah.
is Britain in 76. It was a loss of sovereignty because it was the IMF which dictated the way out for Britain before Mrs. Thatcher. So the fiscal union is only an example of the fact that democracy can finance whatever you wish, huge or limited social transfers, for example, but you have to finance them. And you mentioned the Merkozy-Papandreou relation in Cannes. I also disagree, but it's more subtle. I think that Papandreou was not committing suicide at that day. I think that he was betting on a yes result from the Greek population. Because like the Irish lady, the Greeks answered no to austerity, but remember me, any poll where you see people accepting austerity, that doesn't exist. And the Greek polls show that they want to stay within the Eurozone. So it was a bet, probably too dangerous a bet for Merkel and Sarkozy, who said, well, you have to decide within or out. And so after that, he was pushed out by Greek politics and not by Sarkozy and Merkel. Three quick questions. Number one, given where we are now, have you seen in the recent negotiations something which could suggest that the Eurozone as a rule, besides Germany, besides the Dutch, besides the Finns, that the Eurozone could be prepared to organize the exit of Greece because it's so unmanageable that finally it would be the solution. Second, about the future steps in political terms, you have noticed that Germany is not only speaking of fiscal union, but of federalism more generally. And it's not new because Schäuble, you remember Lammers Schäuble in the 90s, the Germans are making proposals for increased integration and federalism. And since you come back from France, did you perceive any willingness in France to go in that direction? I suspect no. Right. And finally, you did not mention the UK, which is a very important European actor. And the news regarding the UK in the recent months is the fact that the channel has widened. So how do you see the future of the UK-EU relationship?
Yeah, all right. Do I see anyone in the, I'll take your questions in order. Do I see anyone in the Eurozone willing to organize the exit from Greece? I think right now the sincere belief of people who are working on the Greece problem is that there is no way envisioned that a country can be removed by others from the Eurozone. But I think that there are hopes, as I mentioned in the case of Schäuble, that Greece may decide to take the initiative. Merkel spoke in the fall in a very ambiguous way about changing the rules. And I think that when I spoke to people in Berlin, what does she mean about changing what rules? They said she mean that's what they're talking about. So I think there is the will for that to happen, for Greece to leave, but I think Germany is still in a very, very long way from wanting to put itself publicly at the head of any coalition to do anything like that. Federalism generally, yes, I think that Schäuble is an interesting figure, and Germany is an interesting country in terms of federalism, because of a lot of its arguments on federalism were formed at a time when, even during the chancellorship of Helmut Kohl, were formed at a time in the 1980s when Germany did not really have any sovereignty to lose. So the stakes for Germany in entering a federal compact are not that were not that high, and I think that Schäuble is still true to that vision. I'm not sure that the people who have become voters since that day feel the same way. Finally, the UK. The UK is not in the euro. An interesting aspect of the UK would be in response to the Irish woman's remark about austerity and whether that works or not. I mean, if you read the newspapers, I would say the pundit class in the UK is not happy with austerity. On the other hand, Britain did get a head start on the problem with austerity, or the problem with stimulus as opposed to austerity, I think, is that in a globalized economy you don't get the full immediate impact of it. I mean that if you want to be fair about stimulus, everyone has to stimulate, or you're going to be stimulating other people's economies and paying you pay the full price of the stimulus, but you only get 60% of the benefits or whatever. Britain undertook austerity before anybody, so I think that it got like a year or 18 months of world demand without any counter responsibility for other people's for paying for other people's stimulus. So it might have been a smart if very perfidious way to go about things. Yeah. So, sir.
Thanks a lot for your talk. I found your discussion of the Strake article very interesting. I'm definitely going to take a look at it, and it's especially interesting because he once wrote very approvingly of these very kind of neo-corporatist arrangements that you describe as being the cow he's sacrificing on behalf of the left. So I guess my question is there something about the political left in Europe, or maybe just in general, that makes it more susceptible to the kind of distributional conflict you describe, leading to these bubbles of spending in the welfare state, and then later during the Euro crisis? Or is this something that you could also say the Christian Democrats were doing in Europe? And how would you transpose that onto the American debate, since I feel like maybe your spectacles might be also influenced?
In Europe, I think that this is a bipartisan consensus, this social market economy, certainly in the case of Germany, and I think it's true. And Britain, you have a sharp ideological divide between the two, between the parties of and left. In Europe, it's pretty bipartisan. In America, 20 or 30 years ago, I would have said that it was a matter of the left, because the left is building the welfare state. It's creating a large, government expense. It's very hard for taxes to fill. Now I feel very differently. I feel that it is a two-party thing, because we now have 30 years experience of a Republican Party that is not willing that is willing to keep all the benefits exactly the same size, but is not willing to tax for them. So it's basically the same. It's describing the same phenomenon as in reverse. Democrats spend 20% more than they tax, but the Republicans tax 20% less than they spend, and it's at the end of the day, it's the same thing.
I was thrown off by the news
No, I know, but you know what? I don't know Strake's work that well, although I've looked some up since I saw that article, and I was just very impressed with it. So, okay, yeah, thanks. Oh, yes, sir.
Is Europe doomed?
No. As I said, no. Europe is not doomed. This is like an example of my colleague at the Weekly Standard, Richard Starr. He's the managing editor. He puts the magazine together. He has a rule, which is whenever you see a question in a headline, the answer is no, because. And it's a pretty logical thing. If I felt confident saying that Europe was doomed, the headline would have said Europe is doomed. And again, I'm not sure I'm the one who composed that headline. But no, what I think is imperiled, I think, is a certain style of popular sovereignty that we've come to think of as democracy. The democracy as it's been practiced in Europe for most of the last 50 years. Sir.
A disconnect between the leadership and the populations. And the question is this a lack of development of historical amnesia for Europeans? Or are the leaders unable to convince the population, the Europeans, of the importance of the integration process? There is a disconnect there between the population and the leaders.
Yeah, I tend to distrust explanations that rely on the idea that the politicians have not been eloquent enough or logical enough or insistent enough in conveying the benefits of a certain course of action. Because I think that's what politicians do. That's what politicians are incentivized to do, and that's what they're really good at, is making these things sound good. So if there's a gap, it's not for lack of trying on the part of the politicians. It may be, I don't know. Well, I mean, they might be differing class interests. Might be one way of looking at it.
It's become very ugly.
Yeah.
And I think that, to me, that means that the population did not integrate at the grassroots level.
Yeah, and I think that prosperity will make people forgive a lot of intellectual inconsistency, and the fact that the so-called ascenseur social, or what we would call the ladder, the ladder of upward mobility is not really functioning as well in these European societies, is probably partly deserves part of the blame for this sort of failure to communicate. Yeah, sir.
Sorry, a comment and a question.
Yes.
The comment is about your understanding of democratic deficit in Europe. The story you told sounds very familiar, right? We have had this discussion about problems with democratic representation within the European Union and complaints about big role of executive agencies in lots of decision-making contexts and so on. I wonder whether, there is something more going on today than it was going on in the past. I think that the examples you gave were the examples where the change took place without violation of any democratic rules, without violation of any constitutional rules in a given country. You have exchanges of governments, prime ministers, which are done by consensus, with consensus of parliament and so on. So I'm not really convinced that there is something terrible going on in Europe in this dimension. Now, the question is about whether you see the current crisis impacting things which EU have been doing in pretty efficient way. So what do you think is going to happen to future enlargements? Is EU, are there any new countries coming into Eurozone in the coming years? Are these going to be new dividing lines that all the other members will keep away as long as possible from becoming a member of the Eurozone and so on? So is it going to be something of multi-speed, coalitions of different sorts Europe developing, and is it important in your view?
Yeah, that's a good question. You're right in the sense that the examples I've given of my worries about democracy, these are not putsches or coups d'états or anything like that, but they all reflect, I think, a migration of power away from local level and towards Brussels, and they are irregular. I mean, particularly the replacement of Berlusconi by Mario Monti was voted in by the Assembly, but he was appointed a senator for life by the president, Napolitano. Even if that's in the Constitution that it's possible to do that, it strikes me as a highly irregular state of emergency type of action. That means that the real interests to be respected are at the European level and not at the Italian level. As for EU expansion, this is a tricky one. I think one thing that it involves France. One thing you very often, if there was any country that had great ambitions for its role in Europe, it's France. And I have to say, I think that France is probably been the country that's been most disappointed by the events of the last 3 or 4 years. And it's not just by the economic downturn. France, and I think this is true both in the governing coalition and among the socialist parties, and you certainly hear it certainly hear it in both parties. France believes that something happened in the rapid expansion of and if there are any Frenchmen here who want to correct me, I'd welcome it. But I think that a lot of French people believe that the expansion eastward was a fatal dilution of French power. That France had enough demographic weight to be the controlling opinion in Europe, but that after expansion that became impossible. I think there were a couple of other factors besides the sheer demographic weight of the East that made that possible. One is the gradual emancipation of Germany from its post-war guilt after reunification. I don't say total, but Germany is now willing to obviously express its opinion for Europe. But I think that this feeling in France is so strong that France is going to take a lot of. I mean, I know there are countries that do want this eastward expansion. I mean, Poland would even like to see, Ukraine and perhaps eventually Belarus in the European Union. But I think it's going to be a very hard sell to France, is my opinion. Yes, sir.
Question regarding the journalistic debate or the debate and perceptions of journalists in the United States, your colleagues in the United States, because I kind of get annoyed when I see titles like "Is Europe Doomed?" Now I'm really happy that you told me that the question mark actually means that it's not doomed. But you constantly see that above all in the United States, but it's always connected to the euro crisis, so to the currency. And my question is, do usually or in the journalist community in the United States, do they equalize the euro, the currency, with the European Union? I mean, do they realize or do they acknowledge that there's much more than just this currency, that there is a common foreign and security policy, even a diplomatic service, which is currently being built up, that there's a acquis communautaire and 70% of laws coming from Brussels and not from Madrid, Paris, or Berlin, or whatever? Or because I have the impression that everybody always focuses on this euro crisis and thinks that this means that Europe is going to collapse. But it's not only a currency. What do you?
Well, I mean, this is the first real big thing this is the first real big way that the European Union has affected the world. I mean, when from America, I think that we're as provincial as other countries. Probably not more provincial, but probably equally provincial. When we look at Europe, we say, okay, what's Europe doing that we really have to worry about? Up until recently, let's take at random the example of the Iraq War. All right, that was not a European thing. Those were decisions that were made by individual nation states. France and Germany against, Britain, the Netherlands, and Italy and Poland for, Spain against, then Spain for, then against. So the EU did not come into that. And I think that this is the first. The euro is the face of the European Union for this. As for Lady Ashton and Herman van Rompuy, I don't think that they've really made enough of a. You can say that those that the presidency and the defense establishment are being built up in Brussels, and I believe you're right, but they really, I think the impact they're making on Europe is minimal. The acquis communautaire, those are mostly questions that affect domestic policy. I don't think Americans are any more interested in them than they are in, say, German welfare policy. I mean, and German welfare policy just had a monumental reform that's had huge consequences, and I don't think that anyone knows what it is. So I do. I'm afraid I do think that this is the main thing Americans know about Europe at this point. So, sir, yes.
Yeah, I want to say I'm very sympathetic to what you have to say.
Oh.
But I wanted to form a minor challenge in the form of sort of a hypothetical about the future. I was thinking about what you said about Jean Monnet and how he said that Europe is sort of forged in moments of crisis. And I was wondering if perhaps instead Europe actually muddles through crises, and once things get better and they've had the chance to absorb the lessons of that crisis, that's perhaps actually when they're better at sort of forging institutions of European unity. So if you apply that to the current crisis, I mean, obviously there's been this long simmering democracy deficit, but it's really the global economic downturn that's brought it to the fore. That seemed to be a lesson that I took from your talk. So my hypothetical is, let's say that there happens to be a unexpected sort of strong global economic recovery, probably in spite of Europe rather than because of Europe. But it sort of lifts Europe up. GDPs increase, tax revenues increase, debt to GDP ratios fall. Greece may be a lost cause at this point, but some of the other states on the precipice, they're sort of lifted slightly out of this crisis, and Europe can sort of take a breather politically. What's to prevent Europe from, in this moment after the crisis, if there is a global economic recovery, from actually solving, from in this moment of being able to solve these problems, these political problems?
What's prevented?
Yes.
I think the main thing that's going to prevent it is demographics. And this gentleman who just asked the question mentioned that Americans tend to look at Europe and they only see the Euro crisis. And I thought the question you were going to ask was isn't the United States in pretty much roughly just as bad a shape? And my answer would have been yes. But the thing that would really worry me, even if you had a very good conjunctural upturn in the world economy, would be demographics. And in the example I would give is this. Italy. The United States and Italy, now have roughly the same government debt per capita GDP. Italy is up, I think it's got up almost to over 110%, but we're now over, we're heading towards 105%. We're around the same thing. However, we've got 320 million people. In the next generation, our country is projected to grow to 400 million people. We're going to add 25% to our population in the next generation, which means with discipline, our debt, our per capita debt to GDP will fall. Italy, over that same period of time, and I know this year's census is not out, is projected to lose about a quarter of its population. I'm surprised that bankers don't discuss this more overtly, because there's when you look into the nitty-gritty of some of these discussions, I mean the German Merkel's Council of Economic Advisors, where the Sachverständigenrat, we're talking about, they had a plan for debt redemption for Italy when Italy was in big trouble last fall, and it involved Italy running a 4% primary surplus, and that way you did build down the debt over 20 years. But how do you do that when you're losing population? I mean, when you're losing a big chunk of your population. So I'm saying there are certainly reasons for optimism in Europe, but among the reasons for pessimism, I would say that would be a big one. Yes, ma'am.
So you're talking about the opening up of fault lines, partly as a result of the economic crisis, a lot between elites and non-elites. In your slightly less recent work, the reflections on the revolution in Europe, you're also talking about fault lines between elites and population concerning immigration issues. And I'm wondering, in terms of the economic crisis and the problems that you see rising from immigration, are we just putting immigration on the back burner? Are these going to intersect at some point? How do you see the two of those going together, if at all?
I think it's on the back burner. And I think it's like, just as in this country, I guess recently there was a big ruckus over contraception and things like that. But in the same way that the so-called social issues are kind of on the back burner here, they won't stay there for very long, because if the government because these social issues are also they're identity issues, so they can become very important to people who feel themselves disrespected by a government. But I think for now there is not one thing you can say: voters have not abandoned hope that their governments can get these problems under control. And as long as they don't, I don't think you'll see much anger. They seem to have abandoned hope in Greece. I mean, I have not been there, but I mean, to judge from what I see on TV in the last couple of weeks. In that type of environment, then I think you can get a situation, you can get a loud popular misgivings about immigration and other things, but not right now. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I came in a little late. I don't know. Have you stated a view as to what you think Greece should be doing? And I guess by that I mean the Greek government, and that may change, I guess, in April. So there may be two different governments that could be discussed. But more specifically, at a panel here a few days ago, there were two things that were mentioned that were of interest to me. One, Martin Feldstein seemed to be advocating a default, but with the notion of taking a leave of absence. And there were some jokes made about that. Would that be with or without pay? So what's your view about it, about the wisdom of a default? One of the other members of the panel, Richard Cooper, who works in international economics a lot, thought that a default would be much more catastrophic than 10 years of unwelcome, severe austerity, which it was his estimate. But he suggested in another area a reform where Greece would increase the value-added tax on imports and use that to offset that with a reduction in the payroll tax, hence making labor in Greece, quote-unquote, more competitive. And that this would be an interesting way of addressing the current account imbalance and the lack of competitiveness in relation, to the rest of Boris. So this is an idea that then, of course, people say, well, they don't collect taxes anyway. So, but anyway, those seem to be two interesting views.
They do, and I'm not an economist, and the last thing I would want to do would be to, second guess Martin Feldstein. I just don't have the expertise to offer a definitive Caldwell plan for the rescue of Greece. I'm not going to lay like that out. I think that Greece has become so import dependent that a tariff on imports would be an austerity by other means. But we do have, speaking of defaults, we have at least one and maybe a couple of very strong indicators that defaults can have much wider ranging consequences than we thought. One, of course, is Lehman, but the other, closer to Greece, is that when the run on Italian and Spanish debt after Merkel began to talk about PSI or private sector involvement. When Merkel began to talk about, she insisted on giving haircuts to the private lenders in Greece. I don't think that anyone sort of anticipated what the consequences would be for Italian and Irish and Portuguese debt. So I don't know. It doesn't strike me that you also mentioned that Mr. Cooper, I guess, said that a default would be worse than 10 years of austerity. From here, it looks like a default would be worse from 10 years of austerity. From Greece, it might look different, because I don't, the kind of austerity that's been heaped on Greece. I mean, people say that there's never been anything like it in the history of the world. I mean, in a sense, it's just an accounting convention. You can't. I think we might push them beyond they might be beyond the extent of austerity that even a society with the best will in the world, fully compliant with everything everyone says, could possibly achieve. So that's a long way of saying I don't know. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the lecture. And even if it was a very pessimist view on Europe, and I feel like a European citizen. I have two questions. Do you think, because you said that the United States
had better succeeded faced the crisis than the European Union. Do you think that the United States could help the European Union, could bring some solution? And do you really think that European Union can learn about the American success on face to crisis?
Facing
Facing crisis. Yeah, did I say that we'd faced the crisis better than the European Union? I'm not sure I said that. I don't.
Can bring some solutions to European Union, or?
We're so lucky we have the reserve currency that I think that our every waking thought should be sort of devoted to how to preserve its role, and that's not yet a Europe is not yet in that position, but no, you know what, we're talking about Europe. I was invited here by the Center for European Studies. I talk about this issue where democratic publics tend to want more from the economy than the economy can offer. But I have to say, I think that problem is just as bad here. It's just as severe. I mean, if you look at the inability to come to any consensus about how to close this, I believe we're now running an 11% deficit. I mean, the American fiscal indiscipline is extraordinary. I wouldn't wish these lessons on anybody. It's just that Europe is what we happen to be talking about. So, yeah.
There's a question I had also at our lunch. Yes, is Greece so different from the rest of Europe, and is Europe so different from us? And isn't this therefore a problem of democracy? And you spoke of difficulty of the deficit of democracy, but it's the indiscipline of democracy that's the cause of this. So isn't there this sort of general cause, namely the principle of the welfare state, which was beautifully stated long ago by Harry Hopkins, advisor to Franklin Roosevelt, as said, spend, 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 tax, 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 elect, elect, elect. And notice that spend comes first, and that tax doesn't necessarily equal pay for, and that pay was never added. And also notice that that came from one of our two political parties, and I don't think that the other one is quite equally guilty, if I can say so, and perhaps that the main difficulty of the rest of the world is that there aren't enough Republicans.
Well, we were saying earlier that when we look at these welfare states of Europe, they're bipartisan in most places, but that in Britain there is a very strong ideological divide between right and left. I'd say more. And there's one shaping up. I would say in Sweden. I don't know about other countries so well, but the Anglo-Saxon tradition of negative liberty and the British constitutional system, out of which our idea of the role of the state grows, I think is a little bit different. And I don't think that kind of conservative party is going to grow up in all continental European countries. I agree that the welfare state has grown to unmanageable size. I think that part of the problem, though, is this migration upward to higher and higher levels of government responsibility. I think that you create if welfare were administered at the level of the town, it might be less fair on a nationwide basis. But what you would avoid is the sense that everyone collecting welfare has that this isn't really costing anyone anything. The lack of accountability. So I think that as budget accountability moves upwards, you get less of it. But I agree. There is an element here that is just a straightforward problem with democracy, and it's why I don't want to teach your class, but I mean I think it's why virtue is less necessary in a democracy. Once you sort of lose these lessons, like neither a borrower nor a lender be, you put a democracy on a very dangerous road that it has a hard time getting off. Yes. Sir.
Comment about the reserve currency question. I wonder if you could speak to the issue of the possible perverse effect of the crisis of the euro enabling further profligacy on the part of the United States. What I mean to say is the fact that the euro is at risk, that makes it easier for Americans to borrow at a time when
So because you have a flight to safety and stuff, and that, I mean, it wouldn't be the most perverse thing. I mean, the most perverse thing came when the United States lost its AAA credit rating, and the result was that money rushed into, the United States, lowering interest rates. I mean, so yes, I mean, I think that that could result. I mean, but in order for the United States has, because of its legacy as as the world's currency anchor, has got a lot of lucky breaks out of during this downturn, and to make sure that it continues to get them, it's going to need to sort of run its economy a little more responsibly than it's doing now. Yes, sir.
I have the overall question is really about the sort of political response to the crisis. And I guess the first part of it is just sort of, why hasn't the left been able to make something of the crisis? Now, of course, there is a certain view that it's caused by the welfare state and all the rest of it. I don't say that there's nothing to that view, but there's an alternative view, which is, something's wrong with capitalism, panics in the bond market and all the rest of it. Things have been under-regulated. And for that matter, if a budget deficit needs to be closed, sometimes willingness to tax is a way of closing a budget deficit, and that the left could find a way of finding, let's say, land taxes, wealth taxes, etc. But they don't seem to have been able to make much of it at the moment. At least that's my view. And then I suppose I have the other question is about what you might call the extra parliamentary opposition. And I don't necessarily mean the sort of mainstream trade union movement saying don't cut the public service pay by 3% or whatever. But I mean, I'm just wondering what there is, or what your view is about whether the current environment creates the possibility for new forms of political extremism. So both in Greece and in Italy, and maybe even in Germany, you've sometimes had sort of anti-democratic, violent movements against labour market reforms, against privatisation and so on. We haven't seen too much of that, and thank God. But I'm just wondering whether you have a perspective on that sort of question as well.
I don't, and I'll look to take them in order. What has happened to the left? Well, I don't think that a sort of a real coherent left program can spring out of nowhere. I mean, I think that we may underestimate the extent to which the infrastructure of the left, if we can call it that, was just devastated by the discrediting of the Soviet project. There are not real big left-wing movements in most countries, and they don't have a lot to work with. I mean, I'm impressed that in France, this left party of Jean-Luc Mélenchon is getting, it's at like 11% in the polls. That's interesting. And there's there's the Montebourg movement in the Socialist Party. That's pretty big, but I just don't see a left in terms of an anti-capitalist left. I mean, the Democratic Party is the party on the left in the United States. You think of the people who are in Democratic administrations and in the Congress, they don't look much like a left. I mean, Larry Summers, who had an affiliation with this organization, you know what I mean? That's not, right? It's not the guy, he's not like the guys I used to see when I was an undergraduate, like selling the socialist worker on Mount Auburn Street, you know? So I just don't know that there are that many left people where you would first look at them. Now I think that there are, there's popular disgruntlement. And when you say, could this form new types of extremist movements, maybe, but in the Donald Rumsfeld way, that's kind of an unknown. If there are new types of movements, we don't know what they're going to be. I mean, I certainly could see it forming old types of movements. I mean, just sort of the kind of movements that you get when you have unemployed workers of left and right who feel they've been cheated out of their, what is owed them, and you mix them with a demagogue, and and I'm not sure. I don't speak Greek and I don't read the Greek newspapers. I'm not sure that's not happening to some degree in Greece, but I don't really know at this point. Yes, sir.
Answer the question for you, since you don't speak Greek. Thank you. So the left has gone up, actually. In the last polls, probably the left parties are around 35%, which is the most they've gotten ever. In that sense, there is a rise of the left. And the second biggest party, according to the polls, is a left-wing party right now. Of course, we have a peculiar situation where in the Greek parliament, the second biggest party are independent MPs because they've been booted out from their parties for voting against austerity measures. So it's a very critical situation in the sense that it's not normal times. And obviously, you don't get as much of the news here, obviously, of the disgruntlement is not just verbal, it's actually violent. So the most use of chemicals since World War II probably was made in the past 2 years in Greece by the Greek police. So in a way, you do have huge tendencies of what you're suggesting, and the indignados in Spain and moreover, in other places, could be seen as a left-wing movement. Again, it's not coherent, as you very well said.
That would be a new kind of left-wing movement, yeah.
But French intellectuals maybe are not as vocal as they have been in the past. That's a different question. But Hollande was against the measures recently, so.
Yeah, but we were discussing that a little earlier. I was discussing that with some French people earlier today. I think that might have something to do. The fact Hollande is so close to the euro, he's so close to Jacques Delors. He's got and he has a divided party, that is part Europhile, part Europhobe. So I don't think that anyone seriously thinks that in power, Hollande would try to scuttle the European bailout measure. But it's interesting, no one has mentioned the Occupy movements. I mean, I don't know if anyone, is that because you don't consider them a serious left-wing movement, or? No. Well, they have them. They are there, yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I think... we have a reception afterwards, if you like, and so we want to thank Mr. Caldwell.